Okay, so let's get back to Han China. So the Qin dynasty is the first imperial dynasty of China, but it is relatively short-lived. It more or less ends with the reign of Emperor Qin, and then we have a new dynasty. These people are ethnic Chinese. This is the Han community that lives in and around the Yellow River. And they establish a long-lasting, stable dynasty that embraces Confucian ethics and political values, and as well as sponsors the civil service and a huge flourishing of the arts. Their capital is going to be what is modern-day Xi'an, but it was Chang'an anciently. The empire is vast. It controls most of the area that is today China, excluding the northern regions of Manchuria and the regions of the western deserts and the Tibetan Plateau. But this is the heartland of China and really defines what China is going to be. The Han Dynasty is a massive empire. It lasts for 400 years. Its height is around 200 years BC to around 200 years CE, and that means it's roughly analogous to the height of the Roman Empire. In terms of territory, though, it's bigger than the Roman Empire, and in terms of economics, it's probably 4 to 5 times bigger than the Roman Empire. But what's so interesting about it is, despite it being this massive empire, this huge economic displacement, there really isn't a lot that survives from the Han period. This is one of those things that's the product of the accidents of history. In the Roman Empire, Romans preferred to build in concrete and stone, so we have lots of sculpture, lots of bronze, lots of buildings and things to look over. But things built in the Han Dynasty were made out of ceramics and silk and wood, and most of the architecture was wood, and that simply hasn't survived. There are no significant Han buildings that survive. So despite the fact that this being every bit as big and as impressive as the Roman Empire, there's not a lot to take a look at. What does survive is funerary monuments. So much like Emperor Qin, these emperors built huge tumulus mounds, these kind of pyramidal mounds, and they had tombs built underneath them. These tombs had vaulted structures that were either made out of brick or large slabs of stone. This one has been excavated entirely to expose the structure. But here's an example of what one of these would have looked like. And inside of these we find a wealth of grave goods. Things like these beautiful Han female dancers in ceramic that show these long sleeves, which was indicative of the kind of dress that would continue to thrive in China for a long time. We have these beautiful horses. Horses are going to be a very powerful symbol throughout China and its history, because horses are an extension of military power. So whenever you see an equestrian figure, it generally represents this extension of military power. The horses are going to have a very stylized appearance. They have these very long and slender legs that go down to very small hooves, as well as a long and pointed snout, but compact, round, muscular bodies. And we will see this kind of style continue on going forward. So we're going to see cavalry figures, again, emblems of power, but also emblems of the court. Here we have a Han figure of a woman holding a mirror, again an indication of status, with an elaborate headdress. These are not terribly naturalistic figures. The drapery isn't terribly realistic, but they have a certain life and dynamism to them all the same. They seem to be very simple in their line, much like what we've seen in paintings. A few of these tombs have preserved some really remarkable items. For example, we have the entire preserved tomb of Lady Dai. And Lady Dai was this Han Dynasty noble who was buried with a wide variety of artifacts. Her mummified remains were actually still intact. She had a series of tombs encased inside, and at the very center of this was this tomb, this sarcophagus with these lively dragons and dancing figures painted around the exterior of it. Probably the most famous monument is going to be this. This is this funerary banner. And the funerary banner is one of the earliest surviving examples of silk painting. So the silk painting shows her aspirations for her life. It shows at the very bottom the underworld, and immediately above that it shows her body with mourners. And so we get a scene of people gathering together vessels, in addition to gathering together vessels, having a meal, honoring her much the way that ancestors continue to be honored. And then we have these interlacing dragons, and ultimately these interlacing dragons frame a scene of Lady Di and her attendants. And this is her being elevated to the status of heaven. You have these beautiful clouds and beautiful dragons on either side. And when we look at a detail of this, we can see it has this very thin calligraphic-like line painted onto it. She is larger than everyone else. It makes sense. She has these very beautiful robes. And then at the very top, we see her kind of transcendent, elevated into the realm of heaven. So we see magical figures, we see deities, and figures that are associated with her family crest. Some of these Han period tombs are really exquisite. Some of these tombs conclude what we would call jade suits. Jade, by virtue of being very hard, very durable, very lasting, becomes this element that represents eternity and everlasting life and rebirth. And so they would preserve the body by taking a series of jade plaques fitted with gold wire and stitched to a silk background that would then encase the entire body. Really remarkable stuff. But really, that's what we know about the Han Dynasty, is from its histories that have been passed on and from the archaeology of its tombs. No major Han works of architecture survive. And so the only way we can interpret Han architecture is by looking again at these tomb models. So it was a very common thing that these tombs would have towers. These are clay ceramic objects that are placed in the tomb, and these are meant to represent watchtowers, fortifications. These are things that would protect the deceased into the afterlife. And they give us a real insight into Han architecture and what would happen in the future of Chinese architecture. Chinese architecture is very, very idiosyncratic. It has a number of features that we don't see anywhere else, and we can examine these features and know that they were present in the Han Dynasty by looking at these tomb models. So here we're going to look at a kind of wooden recreation model of a typical Chinese hall. The first thing you'll notice that these things are supported on wooden columns, and that they're entirely made out of wood. As all of this is fitted with very closely fitted joinery. Traditional Chinese wooden architecture doesn't have nails, or at least it has very, very few. Instead, this is all closely fitted by wooden joinery. The characteristics of Chinese architecture is you're going to have hipped roofs. That means that unlike most architecture where you have a pronounced gable on one end, this is going to be pushed back into this hipped roof. It's going to have broad eaves. A lot of China is very humid and very warm in the summer, and so you would want to have and it also rains quite a bit, and so you need broad eaves to protect the sides of the building and the wooden structures from rain. But it also created a kind of easeway that went around the outside of the building that also is incorporated in the living space of the house. So you could open up the walls, open broad screens that would allow you to use this outdoor space. So you have these free-form open plans that have walls that essentially can be opened up, and you have an interior-exterior kind of arrangement that brings the interior and the exterior space together. This is true still today of a lot of traditional Asian architecture, and this was very much an influence on modern architecture. When Frank Lloyd Wright actually built his first prairie homes, he incorporated a lot of these ideas: long, low, horizontal buildings, hipped roofs, open floor plans, broad eaves, the mixture of indoor and outdoor spaces, all of those things that we associate with Frank Lloyd Wright and modern architecture, he just ripped off from Asian architecture. He actually went to the Columbia Exposition in Chicago, and they actually had a number of Japanese and Chinese buildings built in reconstruction, and he was very inspired by that. So some of these tomb models show entire villas or compounds, and you can see that they have a surrounding wall, but you can see they have all the same characteristics. Wooden screens that allow movement of air and light, clay tile roofs, hipped roofs here, and then broad eaves, all supported on wooden architecture. There are many textbooks. This one's was first printed in the 12th century, but this is a very, very early textbook, not as early as the Han, that shows these complicated joints that are made without nails, where you have complicated fittings that fit into very precise locations with scarf joints, etc. This actually works very well for the region because earthquakes are very common in China. It's an earthquake-prone region, which is something that I'm more conscientiously aware of since we just had our own earthquake. I have a friend who's living in North Dakota, and they're suffering from floods. So I said, I see that you chose plague with the flood option. I'm glad Utah chose the earthquake option. It's over sooner. End of times humor. How else could we possibly get through? So China is prone to earthquakes, and what's amazing is that when they've had earthquakes recently, a lot of the modern constructions made out of concrete and steel rebar have failed while the wooden architecture survived. These wooden joints allow for the building to flex and move. And so maybe you understand why they embraced wooden architecture. They have plenty of wood to do that. And so all of these beams and posts and fittings are joined. But there's one area that I want to call attention to, and that is this thing right here, these under-eave brackets. We see these brackets on the actual clay models. So you can see a bracket there and see a complex bracket there. This is duogong. And a duogong is this characteristic feature of Chinese and later most all of Asian architecture. If you have broad eaves to keep the rain off of the side of the buildings and to provide these places where you can shelter and enjoy a kind of balcony or a kind of a veranda that will allow you to have access to the outdoors but still have some kind of measure of shelter, then you need large wooden brackets to support those eaves. Those large wooden brackets, as you can see, have one support that runs one way, and then another, and then two more, and eventually these cantilever out until you end up with these very, very large, beautiful brackets that the form becomes this duogong. And the duogong is characteristic of a lot of Asian architecture. As you can see, it happens in multitudinous various forms. I'm not an expert, but were you an expert, you'd be able to look at a dugong and say, oh, well, this comes from the southern provinces, or this one comes from this particular valley or this particular city. They are as idiosyncratic to their location as the craftsman traditions that produced them. And it does create this very beautiful kind of aesthetic appearance. It's clear that at some point these were purely practical, but they became far more than practical, and they became part of the formal architecture and decoration of the buildings. One of the other things that's characteristics about these buildings is you'll notice that they have uplifted corners. That this is a very characteristic feature, that the eaves of the corners are actually lifted up relative to the eaves everywhere else. Now, if you go and talk to Chinese today, you'll usually get a whole variety of kind of just so stories about why this is the case, because spirits can come in at the corners and this is a way of defending it. But this originally had a very practical, again, solution. They did not have gutters on these buildings, and so gutters redirect water. If you know anything about the flow of water, water tends to flow right down the edge of something. If you provide an edge or a surface for water to go down, it will run down that edge. And so rather than have it all just kind of creep and run down the edge of the corners, which would cause water damage, they lifted that corner by putting an extra little lift there, and that forced it to shed either to the left or to the right, either side of the corner. And so it actually was just kind of a practical solution to prevent water damage to the building. But it became a kind of flourish that eventually defined a lot of Asian architecture. And then the stories about it being introduced for spiritual or mystical reasons get added after the fact. When it comes to architecture from the Han Dynasty, we're really forced to look at relatively small examples, either tomb models or paintings, or things like this. This is a stone-carved pillar gate. This is a Chu. I think that's pronounced Chu, located at the tomb of Gao. And this one is carved out of stone, but you can see that it's carved with these wooden brackets. You can clearly see the bracket dugong architecture, and it's carved as if it's a ceramic roof. So it's made in emulation of wood architecture and is meant to represent a gate. So only when they transferred their architecture over into stone materials do we get this kind of stuff. It's really kind of shocking how little monumental material, both in architecture or sculpture or otherwise, actually survives from the Han Dynasty, considering how significantly important it was. We do have a lot of smaller decorative works, however, and one of my favorite example is a Boshanlu. A Boshanlu is a mountain-shaped censer. So this is, again, an incense burner. This one's really quite cute. This one has a turtle, and standing on the back of the turtle is a crane, and the crane holds up this bowl, and the bowl would have held hot coals, and then over the top of it is a lid. And the incense would have been dropped on the hot coals, and then the smoke from the incense would have emerged from the holes. And this is really remarkable. I think it actually appears better on this one. This is a very famous one that comes out of the Hebei Provincial Museum. This is the one that shows up in all the textbooks. Beautiful incense burner. Now this one is very similar. We have a lower bowl here, and you can see the seam between the upper and lower half there. But I love how the lower bowl overlaps the upper bowl in a few places. Notice that we have these swirling symbols that represent clouds or smoke. We have animals, monkeys, cats, other wild animals gambling about in the mountains, and then the mountains have swirls of smoke. So to imagine this, you have to imagine what would this have been like when it was in use. It would have given the sense of this irregular mountain peak, and the incense that was used to give out these nice odors to kind of perfume the room, or for purposes of worship, would have drifted up through the holes in the lid and slowly drifted around this, creating this sense of smoke. Why is this so important? Well, if you know anything about China, this matches the landscape of China. So think back to Taoism, that Taoism says you take your cues for how you make the world from the natural world around you. And so any Taoist Chinese artist would have looked at the beautiful Hebei Mountains and would have seen these tall, beautiful, attenuated peaks dripping in foliage, and they're very, very often covered in fog and mist. And so you see this fog and this mist, and the mountains appear to be floating. And so this incense burner, when it had incense and smoke coming out of it, would have recreated this natural landscape. So you could almost think of this object as a multimedia object. It doesn't just, it isn't just a mountain-shaped incense burner. It actually, the incense would have created part of the effect, this all-over effect. It's, again, another way of bringing nature inside. These kind of objects from the Han Dynasty are very important because they give us insights to later periods. Excuse me, cough into the elbow. When we look at later paintings, such as this one, the very famous Summer Mountains, it recreates these techniques. We do not have a lot of hand scrolls or paintings from the Han Dynasty, but we have enough things like this that gives us a suggestion that these ideas were certainly there. It's hard to imagine that something like this could have been crafted, but there would not have been a kind of correlating painting tradition that existed in the world. What we do see from Han painting exists, again, mostly in tombs, and we see frescoes. And the imagery here is not so much concerned with nature. It's more concerned with the things that you'd expect to see in a tomb, especially a tomb of a wealthy and powerful person. Scenes of hierarchy, scenes of authority, individuals in chariots and warriors and magistrates and people on horses. Still, when we look at this painting on the wall, look at how quick and light and calligraphic the brushstrokes are. Things that represent landscape or things that represent cloth are very, very quickly and very loosely brushed in. This is very similar to what we see in later scroll paintings, and so that makes sense that the scroll paintings would emulate a previous style. Here's another example. This one comes from another tomb painting, and in this case we have a series of female attendants. Notice that the female attendants are carrying various objects, and they are all outlined in a very quick calligraphic outline, and then they have these color washes. Unfortunately, the color washes have streaked owing to the damage of these paintings, but this looks very similar to what we'll see in later scroll work. So it suggests that ultimately the origin of scroll painting and this beautiful tradition that we call scholastic painting in the Chinese world ultimately owes its derivation to experiments going on in the Han Dynasty. Well, next brings us to the Three Kingdoms and the Six Dynasties. You have a series of powers that emerge out of the collapse of the Han Dynasty. And you can see the numbers and the dates thereof. Eventually, this will all come together under the Jin Dynasty, and then later the Jin Dynasty will go to the Sui Dynasty, and then later the Tang Dynasty. So it will reunite, but in this time we have a series of warring kingdoms and powers that, before the Jin Dynasty comes along, are constantly fighting each other. Then we have the Jin Dynasty, which emerges for a short period of time, and then we have the Northern Wei and the Lusong Dynasty that exist at this same time period that kind of move over these areas. But this is the time period where scholastic painting, that is scroll painting, the developments of poetry and calligraphy first happen, and where we first get the insights into what will become classical Chinese visual culture. So we need to do a little bit of introduction into Chinese scholastic painting or Chinese scholar painting. The first thing we need to introduce is the nature of Chinese painting itself. It is not painting in the same sense that we would recognize it in the West. When we talk about painting in the West tends to be in very long-lasting permanent media and tends to be monumental. It's going to be frescoes like the Sistine Chapel, or it's going to be large oil paintings, say the works of Caravaggio. But you have to remember that the time period we're talking about here is the medieval time period. So maybe it's not all that different either, because in the medieval time period, the predominant form of painting is going to be in miniatures, in manuscripts. And that's much more like what we're seeing in China. There are two formats that are possible here. One is the hand scroll. And a hand scroll is an interesting artistic tradition. It is a scroll, as you can see here, that's been unrolled, and it has weights to hold it open. Some of these hand scrolls could be short, maybe 2 or 3 feet, and some could be just incredibly long, 40 feet long or more. And so you were never looking at the whole piece at any one time. You would roll up, show a panel, and then unroll it and wind it up on the other end to show another panel. It's also important to know that these are not on constant display. A hand scroll, the format is horizontal, so the narrative and the pictures go this way, from left to right or right to left, more commonly. And most of the time these things are in storage. So hand scrolls are works of art that are meant for collectors or scholars. This is not an art form that's on public display. This was something that was made by scholars for other scholars. So you would go over to a collector's house and he would say, let me show you my Gu Kaiju scroll, and you would unscroll it for him so that he could appreciate it. You could imagine this as a very different experience than going to a gallery and seeing works of art hanging on a wall, or going to a church and seeing large panel paintings or large frescoes in a church. It's a very, very different world. It's a world of magistrates and civil servants, courtiers, who themselves are going to be accomplished painters. This is another thing that's really interesting about painting, is that, as I mentioned, it's a work by scholars for scholars. And so it's an artwork for collectors. Many of the great painters of the Chinese tradition will themselves be magistrates or courtiers in the imperial Chinese court. Also, some of them are princes and nobles. We'll look at a few that are by actual emperors. So everyone who was in the court was expected to have the taste and erudition to not only collect these and appreciate these, but to make some of their own. And so hand scrolls were this really amazing tradition where you had an upper crust elite. But remember, there's a bit of a meritocracy, so you could have been a peasant that rose up in this, and as you rose up through this meritocracy, you yourself would teach yourself to paint. And every scholar, every courtier, at least, even if they weren't that great at it, painted a little. So you have a very different body of people. Unlike the West, where painters are specialists, painters are craftsmen. And for most of the history of Western art, until you get to the later Middle Ages and the Renaissance, they're not even really considered all that special. They're there to do a job. In the Middle Ages or the Renaissance, I pay you to paint something. I'm the patron. I get the credit. It's not until the Renaissance that the artist is seen as a worthy position. But even then, the vast majority of people were not expected to be artists. They were not expected to paint. But in the Chinese court, that's entirely different. If you were a courtier who was half your salt, half your salary, you were expected to paint and to be proficient. There were 3 things that you had to be really proficient in. Calligraphy, because writing was very important, because writing is how you do your job by sending out decrees. But you were also expected to be proficient in poetry and painting. Those 3 things, these 3 great arts, poetry, calligraphy, and painting, all go together. And in fact, when you see these paintings, there is always calligraphy and poetry involved. A painting in the Chinese scholastic tradition is not complete without poetry or calligraphy. It's interesting. You can do calligraphy and poetry without painting, but you can't do painting without poetry and calligraphy. That's how much the written word and the spoken word were regarded to be equals to the visual image. It's funny, I once read a text, I can't find it again, but it gave a description of what was the ideal artist in the Chinese tradition. And the ideal artist was someone who was very well-mannered, very cultured, who was a civil servant or a courtier, who had a government job, who abided by all traditions, who never ever thought of experimenting but mastered the traditions, etc., and only experimented within the realm of that tradition, etc. In other words, was the complete opposite of our Western stereotype of an artist. We imagine artists as being these mad geniuses, outsiders to society that don't hold to any of the traditions, and certainly we would not suggest that the best painters in our societies would be bureaucrats. We kind of hate bureaucrats. But this was a very, very different world, a very traditional world. So it was an art by scholars for scholars, and poetry and calligraphy and painting all went together. The other option, of course, is a hanging scroll. A hanging scroll has a vertical orientation and generally reads top to bottom. But not always. Sometimes it reads bottom to top. The difference between a hanging scroll and a hand scroll is hand scrolls are mostly not seen. They're mostly put away in a private collection, and it's only when you and your fellow scholars get together that you say, oh, have you seen my Have you seen my Hongan? I have this beautiful Hongan. And you pull this out and show this collection. So they're very much a private thing. They're a collector's art. Hanging scrolls are meant for public display. Now, as a general rule, prior to the Ming Dynasty, hand scrolls are going to be more popular than hanging scrolls. Again, that's a general rule. There are certainly hanging scrolls from before then. But after the Ming Dynasty, hanging scrolls become the more prestigious art form. And hand scrolls, although they still continue, start to wane. You start to see a more of a focus on individual artists, much like you do in the West. That rather than it being a bunch of courtiers and collectors kind of congratulating themselves and getting together in small soirees, you start to have more of this kind of public exhibition. A hanging scroll, of course, is designed to be hung. And even though it's technically a scroll, you can see it has a rod there and it has a silk backing, usually they're on display all the time and meant to be appreciated. This is much more like what we consider to be a work of art, something that's hung up on the wall that's meant as either a form of decoration or something prestigious that you want other people to take a look at. Hand scrolls are much more given to long narrative format because you're reading through a long story, whereas hanging scrolls are more often given to single views or single objects that exist. And there's a whole tradition of styles of mounting. Most of these are going to be painted on paper, some on silk, but most of these are going to be painted on paper. Paper is, after all, a Chinese invention. The paper, we call it rice paper, but it has nothing to do with rice production. It's not made from either rice or rice straw. It's actually mostly made from the bark of things like mulberry trees and fig trees and similar varieties. It's very durable, translucent paper. But it does have to be mounted to silk in order to support it. And so there's a whole variety of mountings. And there are people who are very skilled that can look at these things and tell you instantaneously what this mounting is and what it means and what period it comes from. So that's a brief introduction to Chinese scholastic painting, a very brief introduction. But I'm going to take a look at this Tang period painting. This is by Han Gan. This is actually a very famous painting that's in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I had a chance to have a curator who was my professor walk me through this, so that's why I'm using it. It's also famous because it's been handed down so many times. And it also helps you explain how these things were understood and how they were interpreted. Okay, so first of all, this is a hand scroll made during the Tang Dynasty. And you can see that it's an ink wash, and sometimes color is added, but usually it's going to be just ink wash on paper, and the background of the paper is part of the aesthetic. The figures are going to float on the page. They're not going to be grounded in heavy, kind of painting. This idea of kind of impasto painting or filling a field with color is just a concept that doesn't seem to exist in Chinese art like it does in the West. The painting should follow what are known as the 6 principles of Chinese painting. These were written down by Shi He. Shi He was a writer and a critic and an art historian in the 5th century. And his six methods are spirit resonance. That is, does the thing have life? Does it have vitality? That the lines should encourage this. This is actually a painting of a horse, and the horse's name is Knight Shining White, and this would be an imperial horse. Horses were seen to be lively and have the spirits of dragons, to be the resurrected, reincarnated spirits of dragons. So you have a flashing, angry eye. The feet are dancing. Again, you can see it has a very kind of long snout, flashing teeth and eye, delicate feet, but massive haunches. That's just the characteristics of Chinese horses. They actually do kind of look like that, but this is even more stylized. So it's supposed to have this energy, this vitality. Anything that doesn't have that kind of lifelike vitality is not good. The second thing it needs is bone method. Bone method refers to how you use the brush, because the brush was made out of bone. The brush handle would be made out of bone. And so it refers to the texture of the brush. And there's a very fine relationship here between calligraphy, which is done with these light, quick brushwork, and the painting. It's supposed to have this kind of sense to it. The third principle is correspondence to the object, and that basically means that you are being faithful to the object. But it's interesting that faithfulness to the object has a completely different meaning in Chinese painting than it does in Western. In Western, we mean faithfulness to the object, we mean naturalism. That is, does it give an illusionistic appearance of the original? That's not what they mean. They mean that, is the line appropriate to the subject? Does it give the vitality of the subject? This concept of just rote naturalism is not something that exists in the Chinese world as we understand it. The fourth concept is suitability to type. So that means that, the application of color, layers, values, etc., the suitability to the subject matter. One is division and planning, what we would consider to be composition, space, depth. And the sixth one, which is very, very interesting, is transmission by copying. And what they really mean by that is this faithful to the accepted tradition of painting? So right away in the Western world, particularly in the modern period, but even in the Renaissance, this idea of slavish adherence to tradition is just not a thing. There is tradition. There's no doubt there's tradition, iconography, other things. But really what's meant is, does this carry on the legacy of this tradition that has existed? So these 6 principles, but the most important are particularly spirit resonance, bone method, which is the brushwork. Spirit resonance, does it have this spontaneous vitality? The bone method, does it have this beautiful calligraphic kind of line, etc.? And this transmission, does it carry on with the tradition? Those are the most important out of the 6. And Han Gan's piece here carries all of those qualities, and so it's why it's a very famous piece. There's a couple of other things here that we could talk about. The first and foremost is that this one gives a good indication of how calligraphy and poetry are always integral to these paintings. As you can see, there are many inscriptions. In fact, this one's notable because it doesn't just have one inscription, it has many. And that's where we get to the seals. These red marks that are made with cinnabar paste are called yin seals. And the yin seal is made with something that's commonly called a chop in English. It's a stone block that has carved into the reverse a seal. And the seal is the name or the title or the epigram of not the artist, but the owner. So the artist, who is the first creator, would have put his yin or seal on this, and he would have placed that seal on there. Seals for artists are very interesting because they had artist names just like we have artist names, and so they would create titles for themselves, artistic titles. Generally, if you were a courtier or a magistrate, you would have your full title in there because that's the most prestigious. And you can see that some of these seals have very, very long inscriptions that give full titles, probably a little bit of their genealogy. And some of them are very simple, that they are just single glyphs or representations. Artists could sometimes get away with just a single name. It's kind of like being Sting or Madonna or Prince or Beyonce. When you get famous enough, you can just drop your surname and everybody knows who you are. And so artists would come up with names. Artist names in the Chinese world are very evocative. They sometimes pick names that are very evocative, like Mountain of Endurance or Shining Lotus or other names like that are meant to evoke kind of Buddhist or Taoist principles. And they're very, very different than their kind of courtly name. And so they would have a seal for that purpose. But most of these seals in these cases are not from artists. They're from other collectors. And this represents nearly 1,300 years of provenance. It's just shocking. So this thing has, and you can practically create a continuous chain of ownership from this thing, from the time it was painted in the middle of the 8th century all the way up to the 20th century, when it eventually was bought by a wealthy family and donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the early 20th century. That's just shocking. I bet you can't think of a single work of art where we know the artist and virtually every person who handled it. And that has to come from this tradition that when you owned the piece of art, you entered into a kind of relationship with the original painting. And your seal, placing your seal on the painting, was a way of demonstrating that and carrying that forward. You can't even imagine something like this in the Western tradition. Can you even imagine, oh, I bought a Rembrandt, now I'm going to put my name on it? I mean, it would never happen. People would cringe in the West. Now, they did do some things like this before. Queen Victoria, when she went on a trip to Ireland, she actually put her name in the end pages of the Book of Kells, if you can imagine that. So medieval objects did have this kind of built-in history where famous people would come and write their names into medieval books. But that's because books were considered, kind of different. But we would never do that today. And for most of the history of painting in the West, a collector would never imagine putting his big stamp right on that thing. And sometimes the stampers aren't even all that careful. You can see how there's a kind of respect for the original image, but otherwise they will go right up to the edge of the image. Well, this thing, what's interesting is the original painting is just this section here, but the scroll is nearly 20 feet long, because they had to continue adding pieces to it so people could continue to add their story to this story. So that brings us to the next piece here, is the colophon. A colophon is an addition added on to a scroll so that you can add additional pieces of poetry. And so people would add additional scripts describing everything from how they came into possession of the scroll, to poetry describing their inspiration of the scroll, to things expressing their scholarship. And as I said, the original image here is not very large, but because so many people owned it over its 1,300-year lifespan, they had to add 20 feet of scroll to this thing just so people could continue to add their seals and their poetry to it. This shows that a work of Chinese painting is very much a living document, and this is considered to add prestige to it. There's a whole collection of very prominent individuals who have put their stamp, literally, on this painting, including several emperors. This was in the possession of several emperors from the Tang up through the Qing dynasty. And it's a demonstration in the Chinese mind of how valuable this object is, that it continued to have reverence over this entire period of time. Outside of Egypt, there's nothing even remotely close to this in terms of artistic continuity. You can't even find it anywhere. Ancient Egypt, they're still doing things in the same style. They still have that kind of reverence for tradition. But having a single object passed from one collector to the next over 1,300 years, it's just insane. It's just incredible. You can't even fathom it happening in the West. So that's the basic introduction to Chinese painting, and I've already gone long, but it's very important. But how did this get started? Well, it starts with generally this kind of classical style of painting is dated to the Jin dynasty, to a character by the name of Gu Kaiji. Gu Kaiji is this very famous scroll painter who did a series of illustrated scrolls that are noted for all of these qualities that we associate with traditional classical painting, this transmission by copying, this faithfulness to tradition, this spirit vitality, this bone method, all of these things. And Gu Kaiji is the person who's regarded to be the person who really exemplified this. Gu Kaiji's scrolls end up being copied many, many times. And unfortunately, we don't have any of Gu Kaiji's works. All of Gu Kaiji's works have been lost, but there have been so many copies of these over the years that we can give you a little bit of sense of what his method and what his style was like. And so this one is a copy. This copy comes from the later Tang period, I believe. but the Gukaiji period scroll would have dated to the Jin dynasty. But the actual scroll here is from the Han dynasty. It's a collection of poems, and it's a collection of poems from a lady of the Han court, who I believe was a dowager empress, but don't quote me on that. My mind is not as fresh as it used to be. And she was writing in the time of the Han dynasty, and so she was rather distressed at the bad manners and bad protocol of all of the women at the court at the Han dynasty. So she wrote a long poem describing what ideal behavior, what ideal female behavior should be. And Gukaiji did an illustration of this during the Jin dynasty, so 4th, 5th century, and then later this gets copied in the Tang dynasty, probably from a copy of a copy. So, just like Romans made copies of Greek works of art, you have, Tang dynasty period Chinese painters making copies of Jin dynasty period painters. So when we look at this, it starts off with this instruction, and you can see right away it has all the same features. We have the yin seals, many, many yin seals. And again, there's a respect for the figures themselves, but other than that. And then there are the actual text, but there's also going to be a colophon and additional pieces of text that were added later on. As we look at these figures, right away, this one's in pretty bad shape. You can see how light the line is. We have some very bold red color, but most of it is going to be this ink wash. And I love how these women's draperies seem to be floating magically in some kind of invisible breeze that elevates them. You can see how light it is. It's really kind of remarkable. As we go into scenes, we see interactions between emperors and their queens. The body of the poem basically tells the story of great heroines of the past who were female members of the imperial court, and uses their example as just behavior. So we have this emperor with his hand there, kind of a patronizing gesture towards this female. But look at her beautiful drapery, the beautiful lightness of the form, all of this floating on the page. Here's another example that shows the imperial family with the emperor and the women of the court with various figures, the delicacy of it. We also have some interior scenes that show women treated. In these cases, the stories here are talking about what is proper for a woman, whether, and there's some kind of moralizing and proverbs regarding, proper hygiene, but also on how to avoid vanity. So this wonderful scene of this person's hair being combed and another person here using the mirror by themselves, indicating kind of different ways. We have this lively guy with a crossbow here as well. And you can see how light and flowing and organic the line is. This is one where I actually know a little bit of the details of the story. First of all, we have a kind of isometric depiction of a palanquin. A palanquin is the chair that the emperor would have been carried around in. And here is the emperor right here. Notice it's badly damaged, but look at how lively these palanquin bearers are, how their feet move, and how they have this wonderful dynamic action. It's a perfect example of this kind of spirit vitality. And then here is the heroine of this story, and notice that her scarves and her scrolls and her dresses just flow off of her beautifully naturally. The story here is this wonderful kind of moralizing tale of a former concubine, and this is the concubine. And she was the favorite concubine of this particular emperor. And this particular emperor loved her so much that he insisted that she ride in the palanquin with him, which was an incredible honor. But a concubine is not a wife. She is a kind of consort, but she is not a full wife. And so here she refused. She absolutely refused because it was not her place. That was a place for the empress. and not the concubine. So she refused, and she instead walked behind. So the message here from a moralizing point of view is that even if the emperor says it's okay, you are not to violate these social protocols. Remember, Confucius highly advocated these very strong moral and ethical codes and placed a lot of emphasis on courtesy and protocol and on maintaining proper decorum. And so this is a message to the women of the court. It says, even if the emperor wants it, if it's not your station to do it, don't let him do it. It's kind of interesting from a perspective because he looks wantonly back at her and is seen as the person who doesn't observe correct protocol, but she does. So it's kind of a powerful image that she's the kind of hero here by virtue of being a concubine. But I love her depiction, the drapery. Here's another scene. This scene is a little bit more straightforward and didactic. This is interesting because what we have here is two soldiers defending the emperor. This is the emperor over here, and they're defending him from the attack of a bear. And where is the lady of the court? She's right there. She is defending. So one of the things that you're required, this is another example from Chinese history that this author was intending to illustrate that you are to put yourself. So not only do you not get to ride on the palanquin, you may have to throw yourself in front of a bear for the emperor. It's really kind of funny, but it's a demonstration of proper courtly behavior. So they did very much value self-sacrifice and courage in this case. This is the British version of this. This is a similar scroll that also comes from the Tang period. You notice this one is without the color. I don't think it's quite as good a copy as this one that comes out of the Beijing Museum, but it's not nearly as damaged. And you can see how there are variations, but this lovely, wonderful, twisting drapery, the lightness of the drapery, the cross-footed position of these soldiers as they turn and fight, how the sleeves flare out, all of this communicates this motion, this spirit vitality. One of my favorite examples of this is this painting. This is again another long scroll, also by Gu Kaiji. This is a Tang copy of a Gu Kaiji, and this is the nymph of the Lu River. It's kind of gross oversimplification, but this is like the story of the Little Mermaid, essentially, and it tells this long story of this nymph of the river, but you can see how it has this lively light washes. Here are the nymph riding in a chariot on the water, and then here's our kind of end scene where she marries. This is kind of this fairy tale story. Would love to get better images of this, but again, it gives this sense of vitality. So one of the other things that emerges at this time is going to be Chinese calligraphy. So Chinese calligraphy goes through a series of developments. We started with the oracle bones, which were very simple pictograms. Then we developed into a bronze script that was meant for writing in bronze artifacts and monuments. And then eventually we moved to what's called a seal script. And here you can see a seal script that has this very straight kind of lines. Here's a kind of painted version of this. This was designed for seal stones and is still used today for seal stones. But then eventually we moved to the brush. And even though this is a rubbing of a stone stele, you can see that it is carved in the form of a brush. That by the time we moved to the Jin Dynasty, the brush has taken over as the primary implement of choice. By the 5th century, China is producing more than enough paper to record all of its historical documents, and so we have brush being produced. This becomes the traditional script, and so we see items such as this. This is a beautiful example. This comes out of the Southern Song Dynasty, this kind of traditional script, and this is a poem. And in this case, the artist is both the poet and the calligrapher. This is done on a form that's known as a fan type. These rounded kind of oblong forms were used as fans and put on handles, so you could fan yourself in the summer heat. But the fans were often decorated and painted, and then eventually they just became a formal element. So this was never used as a fan, even though it has the shape of a fan. But you can see this one also has many different seals on it. It has been mounted to silk, so it has a long history. What's interesting is that calligraphy takes on a life of expression all of its own. That in short order, we move from a very legible but beautiful brush hand to a much more expressive hand. So this is a series of biographies written in this case in, I think this is Shusho, which is a type of script that is kind of a cursive, a shorthand, that instead of drawing multiple lines, you form loops. And it gets very, very expressive. As you can see, you start to even lose the individual forms. You can see how expressive this becomes, that you have really quick brushwork, really rapid brushwork. And calligraphy as itself becomes a kind of art form that is noted more for its expression. Sun Goting was a writer who wrote a manual on calligraphy. This would have been in the Tang Dynasty. And he says that the calligraphy should reveal the character and expression of the writer. So it makes sense that scroll painting, which is borrowed from calligraphy, has this very quick, light, expressive style, that the calligraphy itself would adopt that expressive style. Mi Fu comes along, and he's one of the most noted calligraphers of the Song Dynasty. And here's an example of some of his work. Here's another example. I mean, you can see that. It's just, wow. That's just insane. I was extraordinarily comforted to find out that even native Chinese speakers have a very difficult time reading some of Mi Fu's calligraphy. That made me feel a lot better. Because I don't know how you kind of intuit this out. But the point of this is that you are not, it's not about the writing. Ultimately, it's not about the writing. It's not about legibility. It's kind of funny because we live in a world of graphic design where legibility is kind of stressed more than anything else, as can it be, read. And this shows that legibility was not the first concern. The first concern was expression. You have a later writer by the name of Su Shi, who himself was a calligrapher, who talks about Mi Fu's works, and he says that it was like a sailboat hit with a sudden gust of wind, or a warhorse charging into battle. That was his metaphor for it. So they really valued this intense, expressive style. That just seems very foreign to us, that a style, particularly in writing, is regarded as better if it's expressive. I know that in Islamic tradition, legibility is everything. But when you get to the Chinese tradition, it's not always everything. So getting back to our diagram of the Silk Road, it's very important to know that the Silk Road is the main transmission by which Buddhism finds its way across to China. And so we start to see places develop at Danyang, right here, where we have Buddhist monasteries. And they are being established so that people can, in fact, trade through the area. They become way stations, caravanserai, oases for people to stop, but they also become natural places for monks to proselyte. And so this is the Mogao Caves at Danhuang, which is in western China today, but right along the Silk Road. And you can see that it's a natural oasis, but built into the cliff is a series of monasteries. And they first started building things here back in 4th and 5th century, but most of what you're going to be seeing here is Tang and Song period. But we have a series of beautiful caves, all of them painted with images of the Buddha. At a similar location, we have the Yungang grottos. Now, the Yungan grottos are actually on a spur off of the Silk Road. So they're actually deeper into China, much deeper into China than Dunyang. Dunyang is on the outskirts of the western edge. But at the Yungan grottos, we have another series of monasteries carved into the living rock, very much like what we saw at Bamiyan. But here we have the emergence of these colossal Buddhas. When we see these Buddhas, the Buddhas represented are going to be colossal forms. And they're a mix of, again, styles coming out of India, the Gupta and post-Gupta periods, but they're also going to be mixing with native ideas as well. You can see this one has a series of holes indicating that it had attachment to it. Some of these are fairly badly eroded. Others are really beautifully preserved. This is the Buddha Vairocana. It's one of these cosmological Buddhas, cosmic Buddhas that you are supposed to be taught by if you pass over into the Pure Land in Mahayana Buddhism. As we look at it, the scale of it, the size of it, he has these massive earlobes to indicate that he was once a kind of noble. He has the halo behind him, but the top knot, he seems very stylized, a rounded face. The drapery clings to him, and even though we have this kind of use of dramatic drapery there are elements that seem more Chinese, but largely it's a style based on these kind of post-Guptan forms. And that will bring us to classical China, the China of the Sui period, the Tang dynasty, the 5 dynasties of the 12 kingdoms, and ultimately the Song dynasty leading up to the Mongol conquest. So the Sui dynasty conquers most of the heartland. The Tang dynasty is the first to actually go out and conquer most of these western territories. Notice the Tibetan Plateau is still not conquered, and the northern regions and chunks of Manchuria are still not conquered. Then we have a kind of consolidation. At the Tang dynasty, we have a breakup period, and then we have the Song dynasty. The Song dynasty reclaims the heartland, but loses the western territories. And this is where most of the high-end classical art is going to be preserved. A lot from the earlier period ends up being destroyed. But again, the architecture is going to be wood, and so not a lot of it survives. So what we know from tomb finds. And so when we look at Tang sculpture in particular has this really dynamic quality. You can see the shoulder pads and the costume, these deep sleeves. Tang period horses are some of the most beautiful. They have these salt glazes, which have these kind of running glazes, but they still have the same traditional form of the horse. Narrow legs, small hooves, long pointed head, snout, but very strong, thick, round haunches and neck. You can see a lot of dynamism into the figures coming out of the Sui and the Tang period. These dancers with their sleeves out beyond their hands, this lyrical movement, and particularly in these horses. Horses predominate for a variety of reasons, horses being, of course, an example of power, extension of power, military power, but it's the salt glazes that really make them just kind of wonderful and beautiful, all of these wonderful details. We also see a proliferation of religious sculpture. So Tang period sculpture, notice the pendant leg here. These are things that are being inspired clearly by what's happening in India, that Pala and Kalinga, Orissa, all of these regions of eastern India, going from the Tamil Nadu all the way up to the Bay of Bengal, are creating these dynamic forms that we see here. Again, borrowed from Guptan periods, but also producing beautiful steatite icons that seem much more inspired by Pala or Buddhist art. Here we see a Buddha. This is probably Amitabha or Amita or Amituo, again from the Tang dynasty, early 7th century. This one's made in lacquer. Lacquer, of course, is a tree resin that's put over layers of paper and cloth. So this is like cartonnage. And this is why the cloth looks so naturalistic in this case, because it's actual cloth. What's astonishing about this piece is, as heavy and as weighty as it is in terms of its depiction, it's actually incomparably light. It's just a few pounds. So it looks like this massive stone or bronze statue, and yet it's very, very light. And then you can see that it would have been gilt and then elaborately painted. So these Buddhist imagery, this vitality comes across very well. One of the larger monuments that is created this time is the Lashan Buddha. The Lashan Buddha is carved into this cliff face. And again, when you make anything on this scale, it really does get very hard to get proportions right. But we have a series of bodhisattvas or other kind of Dharma protector figures carved into the wall, but the Lashan Buddha is by far the biggest part of the show. Colossal figure. And this becomes the largest colossal statue in the world. I think this is actually technically a little bit smaller than the larger of the Bamiyan Buddhas. It's not as tall, so it's not quite 12 stories tall, but because it's a seated figure, it's certainly much more massive. And so we see him seated with his toes, his hands graced on his knees. When you look to his face, you can see that the face also, it has this patterned hair, which is an addition, which is put on, which was not uncommon. They would carve the stone into the basic features. You can see that some of the paint is still there. He has these neck rings. They were probably a little bit nervous about the shearing qualities of the stone, which is why he looks so flat-faced. I think sometimes that kind of distorts things. I think they were worried about the stone shearing off, so they decided to make it a kind of shallow relief that wraps around this form. But otherwise, we see it continues with this idea. Colossal Buddhas become a very important feature throughout the Tang Dynasty, and now we get to the Longmen Grottos. And in Longmen Grottos, we have, again, monumental Buddhas. And these Buddhas start to take on a more characteristically Chinese quality. Here's a panorama of the Longmen Buddhas and the Longmen Grottos, and you can see that you have this large, colossal, seated Buddha, again, a Vairocana Buddha, I believe. But then we also have these much more dynamic, lively figures that come from kind of Chinese mythology. These guys, you'll notice, have very strong S-shaped spines. They also have, incredible six-packs, or whatever, I don't know, octopacks like that. It's crazy. Very strenuous kind of, like sinews and tendons. And that actually goes all the way back to the Gandharan period. These are Chinese appropriations of Indo-Greek style, but given more exaggeration. And you take a look at this person's breastplate, for example, it very much mimics that Indo-Greek. And so for the Chinese, they didn't know that this had a kind of Indo-Greek tradition. They just knew that this was stuff associated with figures who were protectors of the Buddha. And so they kind of pull it up. That's why you have one leg up, and they kind of give it a little bit more exaggeration. It's really amazing to see aspects and features. You can see it here, that this figure, with its hair and its more naturalistic drapery, actually, and you can see it here, looks more like the Gandharan style. So that those influence from Kushan is really remarkable, that the Mothran style, the more clingy kind of incised style, but also the more realistic drapery, the Gandharan style pops up again here in the Longmen Grottos and these figures. When we get to Tang and Song painting, this is really one of the high points of Chinese art, is scholastic painting at this time period. Landscape painting predominates, but we're also going to see kind of isolated figures. So I've already shown you this one, but the dynamic figure of the horse on a background. Here we see old trees, level distance. And notice that we have very small figures. One of the prescriptions of landscape painting is that the figure should never be larger than the landscape, that they should be appropriate in scale to the landscape. So they would never do a close-up foreground shot of a human being with the landscape in the background, because that would imply that the human is somehow as important as the landscape. Instead, the people would be shown in scale to the landscape. Plus, this is a way for the viewer to interact. We see a path cut through the painting, and you see these people, and then rather than these people being just any other people, they become you. They become a vehicle by which you can interact with the landscape, and you can see that they are moving through this beautiful, lush, natural landscape with its twisted trees, this very Taoist, beautiful kind of concept, ultimately to a temple beyond. So these are single paintings, but they do tell a kind of story. There is a kind of passing through to enlightenment as you go. The other example, of course, is to show very small scenes, very tight scenes that emphasize natural beauty. A sprig of bamboo coming out of a rock with a couple of finches resting on it. This one's actually by Song period emperor, and it was very accomplished in this. And so here we see these beautiful kind of forms that are created, and that tends to be the scale. It's either very small, really close in scale, or it's very large and very big and kind of dwarfs you. All of this is fundamentally about capturing this sense of natural beauty. This is the very famous Chu Ding. Chu Ding painted the summer mountains. And here you have this hand scroll. Again, these mountains fading in the distance. This is kind of the stuff that looks like it comes out of a Dr. Seuss book. You wouldn't think these are real mountains until you actually go to China and see, wow, mountains really actually do look like that in China. But again, as we look up in details, you see that there is a path. There are little paths. There are individuals fishing on the seashore, and you are meant, and there's also little temples hidden back here. So there is a kind of journey. You are to start looking at this and be awed by the beauty of nature, but then you take a path, and so it avows these kind of Taoist principles. As we move on into the Song period, the artwork gets even more experimental, and you'll notice that there's even more of a reduced style. This is a close-up scene of a much larger scroll, and here you can see in Xie Gui's painting that we are looking out on an expanse. I mean, you see this fishing boat, which seems to be floating in space over here. There it is. I'm not sure why my mouse isn't working. But when we see the whole thing, you realize that most of the painting is in fact given over to empty space. What a concept. That, this idea of negative space. And when we look at the individual brushwork, you'll notice that it's very much a series of very quick brushwork movements. When we look at these trees are painted in. This is the kind of painting that a master probably could have painted in the matter of a day. These quick calligraphic techniques become very expressive. Notice there's our pavilion down there, and there's our figures to draw us into this scene, but then we start at the whole and drawn into it and work our way through the details. This use of negative space, this use of this very, very quick brushwork, you start to see this here. You see that the artwork is becoming really kind of exceptional. Here in this case, this is another one of these fans, and you may say, well, hey, I thought all these were supposed to have writings. And like, oh, yep, they always do. There's a little bit of calligraphy right there. But this one shows a mountain lost in a fog bank. And the fog bank cuts across our view, and so that we're just here on the river. So we're seeing a poet imagining the mountain beyond. His view of the mountain is mostly obscured. So we end up with a painting of mostly nothing. Remember, in Taoism, this accepting of nothingness, this accepting of nature. What a remarkable painting that there's so little there, and yet it communicates so much. It's such a completely different aesthetic than we would have ever expected in the Western tradition. Well, I'm really just run out of time. I've got a few more things that I really do want to talk about. I'm going to talk a bit about portraiture before we close out. I hope you'll stick with me another 5 minutes, because I at least have to get to the arrival of the Mongols. In portraiture, we see these same ideas, and oftentimes it's described that the emperor is depicted as a mountain, that just like these landscapes of mountains and nature are supposed to overwhelm us by their solidity, their peace, and their sense of permanence, that same kind of idea was transferred to the emperor himself. So when we see depictions of emperors, the emperors are often depicted as mountains. Here he is seated on a throne, but he's very impassive. And so the emperors from this period are not overwrought. They're treated almost like features of the landscape, which of course is how they wanted to be viewed. And then I haven't had a chance to talk about, sorry, the slides are jumping around on me. I haven't had a chance to talk about the development of architecture, particularly religious architecture. We don't have a lot of architecture even from this time period. Again, because most of the architecture is built in wood. And so if the architecture is built in wood, it's not going to survive. But we do have a few monumental structures, such as the Wild Goose Pagoda, or the so-called Iron Pagoda. Notice that these things are made out of brick, but they still follow the conventions of wood architecture. In this case, all of these brackets, these dugong brackets, are actually made out of brick, but the little edges here are also meant to look like ceramic tiles, but they are fundamentally it's all brick. The reason this one dates to the 11th century. This is a Song period pagoda, and the reason this one's called the Iron Pagoda is because the red rust color of the brick makes it look like it was made out of iron. So these are very unique structures, a series of multiple tiers that are created, and the question then becomes, how do these pagodas develop? Well, you can see the development of the pagoda in that it is a kind of extension of the stupa. That the early stupas, remember we talked about them in Indian art, were essentially these semi-spheres, these hemispherical domes with a little bit of a chhatra on top. But as they developed, they became taller, and they started to be placed on drums, and the chhatras got taller. And eventually what happened is by the time it translates into China, they interpret that tiered base and chhatra as a building. So a pagoda is fundamentally a stupa, but it is a stupa that's been translated into the native idiom. So here you have the Wild Goose Pagoda, and then this is a later pagoda. This one's based on the Shakyamuni Pagoda of Phogong Temple. Now, this temple is built in wood. A lot of this has been rebuilt over the years, but the original foundation is in the 11th century in the Song dynasty. And here you can see how this functions. So while the Iron Pagoda was trying to render this in brick, this is rendered in wood. And you have the dugongs, you have the broad eaves, and this still functions like a pagoda. You are meant to circumambulate it, except now you go up into it and you circumambulate it on these balconies. Every level of this pagoda will then have a series of Buddhas or representations of bodhisattvas, the largest being the image of Shakyamuni. Shakyamuni is the historical Buddha that is there at the very bottom. So you have a focus that still maintains the central idea of a stupa, but translates it into the native architecture. Translates it to usually an 8-sided figure instead of a circle, although some are circular. And still keeps this central focus, this idea of circumambulation. It takes the idea of the chhatra, this multi-tiered umbrella, and then turns this into the eaves of the pagoda itself, which is good because that will bring us to the Mongol Empire. I hate to skip too much, but we've really got to keep moving if we're ever going to get through with Asia. So we'll stop there, and we'll come back and talk about the great innovations of the Mongols next time, and I think next time we'll just move right after the Mongols and in the Ming Dynasty right into Japan and Korea. We'll wrap that up, which means that next time hopefully we'll get to a little bit of Islam, but Islam's going to have to be rushed, unfortunately. It's very, very hard to get through all of this material, especially when you got to do it, edit it, and upload it. I appreciate your patience. You guys have been great. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.